world is a vampire sent to drain secret destroyers hold you out to the flames. And what do I get for my pain? Betrayed desires and
Welcome back, young scholars. In this video we'll be discussing the interwar period, the time between 1920 and 1939, and this is an age of high anxiety. The big questions you should be able to answer, we're going to actually continue a question from the last video, which is what were the significant effects of World War I? Then we'll look at what caused the increased anxiety in the period between World War I and World War II. And then if we have time, we'll address the question of when did World War II begin. So yesterday when we did this simulation, we learned about the Treaty of Versailles, and we learned about Woodrow Wilson's plan, the U.S. President's plan, to address the long-standing and systemic causes of World War I. So he produced this document called the 14 Points, where he spelled out what he believed needed to happen in order to really make World War I the war to end all wars. So he addressed things like he didn't want any secret alliances. He wanted there to be a reduction of weapons, so it's addressing that issue of militarism. He wanted there to be the establishment of the League of Nations in order to get countries to sit down and work peacefully through any issues that they may have between one another. So Wilson's 14 points targeted the main causes of World War I. That's militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. Many believe that Woodrow Wilson was idealistic. In fact, the U.S. Senate believed that Woodrow Wilson's concept of the League of Nations was too pie in the sky. The United States Senate didn't want to give up any of their power to this new international body, and therefore the U.S. ends up not even ratifying its own treaty that Woodrow Wilson had negotiated. And also, you may recall, Woodrow Wilson, his plan was very different than the plan of George Clemenceau and David Lloyd George, right? David Lloyd George and George Clemenceau were far more interested in punishing Germany. So France and Britain wanted to punish Germany. They wanted to force Germany to accept responsibilities for starting World War I. That was the war guilt clause. They wanted Germany to have to pay huge war reparations, and if you'll recall, it was around $30 billion that Germany was required to pay in order to compensate the French and the British for damage that was done during World War I. They also had to reduce the size of their military to around 100,000 soldiers and about 6 battleships, and they had to completely reduce the size of their air force. Now, the League of Nations was Woodrow Wilson's only significant real contribution to the final treaty. And again, the United States never becomes a member nation of the League of Nations, which is created in the wake of World War I. So the Ottoman Empire, what happens to the Ottoman Empire? It's partitioned in 1922, so a few years after the war is over. The Ottoman Empire, what was left of the Ottoman Empire, remember it had been contracting throughout the 1800s. So what was left of the Ottoman Empire was split apart, and this video will describe how that partition took place.
Almost as soon as the Ottoman Empire joined the war in November 1914, the European allies began staking their claims. In March 1915, Russia announced it wanted Istanbul and the straits linking the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. France accepted Russia's claim and set out its own plans. They wanted the southeast Turkish coast and Greater Syria. Then, in June 1915, Britain announced it wanted the whole western coast of the Arabian Gulf, plus all of Mesopotamia. Britain also wanted to control a strip of land from there to Haifa on which to build a railway. It would give them an alternative route to India, and one day might carry Gulf oil.
The British already had serious interests in the Ottoman Empire. They had already occupied Egypt. They had already moved into the Gulf states. They already had interests in southern Mesopotamia. They already had oil interests in the Gulf. So the war suddenly brought all of this then right to the forefront.
So in order to achieve this, between 1915 and 1917, Britain entered into 3 separate agreements, which all conflicted with one another. One with Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, to give him an Arab state in return for leading a revolt against the Ottomans. Another with the Zionist movement to create a Jewish national home in Palestine. And a secret pact with its Entente ally France to divide the Levant and Mesopotamia between them.
This sounds like it's going to be a problem. So the British make conflicting promises to Arabs in the region, to Jews who are seeking to return to the region under what's known as the Zionist movement. And so, yeah, this is going to lead to all kinds of issues later on in world history. The other thing to note here, remember the Ottoman Empire was the sick man of Europe in the late 1800s, and Europeans didn't have significant interest because we talked about there wasn't a really valuable resource to them. Well, that really changes in the late 1800s with the invention of the internal combustion engine, and then oil becomes a far more valuable commodity or resource. And therefore, as a result of this war, it becomes very clear that they're going to need far more oil in order to run these new planes and tanks and cars that they're developing. And so increased interest in what's left of the Ottoman Empire. And that's why you have states like Britain, like France, like Russia, all rushing in to try and stake territory in the region.
A world away from the Arab provinces, at the heart of British government in London, Sir Mark Sykes prepared for his negotiations with Georges Picot. He told British Prime Minister Herbert Asquith, "I should like to draw a line from the E in Acre to the last K in Kirkuk." And face to face with Georges Picot, that's precisely what he did. He called it practical politics. The Sykes-Picot Agreement was concluded in October 1916. Russia supported it on condition that its own claims to Ottoman territory were accepted by Britain and France. Sykes-Picot drew the map of the Middle East in red and blue. The red zone marked the province of Baghdad, in which the British would have the right to establish such direct or indirect administration or control as they desire. The blue zone covered Cilicia and the Syrian coast, where France would have the same rights. Britain also claimed informal control over an area of northern Arabia, from Kirkuk to Gaza. The French claimed the same informal control over a triangle from Mosul to Aleppo and Damascus. This deal was what the Palestinian writer George Antonius later called a startling piece of double dealing. In June 1916, Sharif Hussein started the Arab revolt against the Ottomans, fulfilling his part of his deal with the British. Only 4 months later, Sykes-Picot was signed, contradicting the British pledge to the Arab people.
What we have to realize, though, is that what we see as duplicity was actually explained by their ideas of the people of the region at the time. And at root of this was their racial outlook of the British policy-making elite at the time of the First World War. They assumed that these peoples couldn't possibly believe for a moment that when the British and the French talked of national freedom, that it actually meant political independence. That would have been a completely crazy idea to their minds because of their racial conviction that the Arab world was backward.
So, have we seen this before? Yes, we have. Europeans drawing arbitrary lines that ultimately form national boundaries that are going to become issues. We saw that in Africa. Europeans also asserting the right to do this because of a belief that they are somehow the superior ethnicity, right? That's the concept of social Darwinism. And so you see it, for example, in just the Treaty of Versailles, Article 22. To those colonies which, as a consequence of the war, have ceased to be under the sovereignty of the states which formerly governed them, meaning the Ottoman Empire, and which are inhabited by peoples not yet able to stand by themselves under the strenuous condition of the modern world. Oh, that's so paternalistic. Such peoples should be entrusted to advanced nations who by reason of their resources, their experience, or their geographical position can best undertake this responsibility. In other words, European powers will help those people that are helpless themselves. That's the thinking behind this. That's classic racism. That's classic social Darwinism. So the League of Nations is going to establish what's known as a mandate system. And it's just kind of a fancy word. The mandate system is just kind of a fancy word for colonies, but governed through the League of Nations. Because at the time, colonies were becoming less and less, I guess, for lack of a better word, cool in world history. So the British are going to establish mandate control over Iraq and Palestine. So Iraq here in Palestine, including the modern-day country of Israel. And the French are going to control Syria here. And again, it's Sykes-Picot who are drawing these boundary lines. So the boundaries are based on the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was this agreement that was set forth by the British and the French in order to divide up this region and assert claims to various parts of the Middle East. Now, in addition to this, on November 2nd, 1917, a British diplomat is going to send a letter to the leader of the Jewish community, the British Jewish community, in which he asserts the right of the Jewish people to return to their homeland, to return to what is the modern day state of Israel, at the time known as Palestine. And again, now the British are controlling this region. They have a little bit more say in how this region will ultimately be settled. And so they're encouraging the Jewish people to return to this region in a movement known as Zionism. So these are conflicting promises that are ultimately made to the Jews. The letter that I just referenced is known as the Balfour Declaration, and it is going to form the basis for some of the claims that will eventually lead to the formation of the modern state of Israel after World War II. But again, there were also promises made, as the video described, to Arabs in Palestine, and so these are conflicting promises being made by the British that are going to, again, sort of spawn problems later on in the 20th and 21st century in this same region. So we didn't get as far as I thought we would. The big question, though, you should be able to answer after watching this video and the previous video were what were the significant effects of World War I. At this point, I want you to do a number of things. One, you can watch a pretty funny clip from The Daily Show about what we just learned about the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the lines that were drawn across the Middle East by European powers. And there's a link to that on the Canvas homepage. You can also watch the crash course video on World War I and the interwar period. It's very good. Or finally, you can work on your SAQ questions. You can grab a textbook. You can read chapter 21. You can do any other homework as long as it's being done quietly and productively. All right. Thanks, guys. I'll see you on Monday.